Hey guys, this is Mike, letusreason.com. Today I want to talk about whether the pre-trib rapture is found anywhere in Matthew 24, which is one of the three recordings of the Olivet Discourse. It's also found in Mark 13 and Luke 21. Now this has been described even by scholars as the most difficult passage to interpret in all of the Gospels. And so I don't fault people for having different views on it or struggling to understand it. I'd been studying this discourse and studying Bible prophecy in general for probably 2 decades before I started to understand it in a way that I'm convinced is a sound way and the correct way. Now, a lot of people think they understand it, but they come to the opposite conclusion that I'm going to present to you in this video. And yet I have to tell you, I think they're ignoring some blatantly obvious factors in this discourse. So what do I mean that they come to the opposite conclusion? Well, simply this. The fact of the matter is that even among fellow believers in a pre-trib rapture, which I'm obviously one, there are disagreements over whether the pre-trib rapture can be found in specifically this discourse that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to focus mainly on Matthew's account. Although what I'm going to show you today is also found in the other Gospels as well. So in other words, many good pre-trib scholars and teachers deny that Matthew 24 has anything to do with what eventually becomes called the rapture, or the supernatural removal of the church from earth to heaven at the end of the church age, as the broad period of the day of the Lord begins. And I think it's obvious that the reason they don't want to see the rapture in this discourse is because they think the context would force the rapture to then be a post-trib rapture instead of a pre-trib rapture. They think that the context forces any rapture in Matthew 24 to happen at the end of the tribulation instead of before it. And since they're already committed pre-tribulationalists, rightly so, due to the evidence found elsewhere all throughout the New Testament, then to be consistent and preserve this belief, they would have to deny any rapture being at all in Matthew 24. Although I would say that they completely overlook all the evidence that I'm going to present today. But just so I'm clear about this, let me try to explain what I just said differently. Because of the wording and the structure or the order of the discourse, it would seem that the section that does seem to refer to a rapture takes place after it discusses what happens immediately after the tribulation of those days. That's the standard kind of view, which they would then obviously think supports a post-trib view. So I think it's because of this that then in order to fend off the attacks of the post-trib camp, these pre-tribbers feel forced to go into the position of basically just denying that the discourse has anything at all to do with the rapture of the church or the church at all. And this way they can both cling to the pre-trib rapture, which is very clearly taught elsewhere in the New Testament. You don't need Matthew 24 to prove a pre-trib rapture. But also denying the post-trib rapture being anywhere in Matthew 24. So for these pre-tribbers, it's kind of like a 2-for-1 deal. Now, I hope you guys are following this, but if not, I think you're going to catch on as we go through this. But what I just described to you really seems to be the majority view among pre-trib teachers and scholars. But I am happy to say that I think that is starting to shift. And there are legitimate scholarly reasons why I believe the evidence not only makes possible, but actually demands that we acknowledge that the pre-trib rapture is in fact found in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. Now, let me say as we begin that Jesus wasn't intending for his audience on that day to have some kind of perfected, full understanding of what the church is or what the rapture is. That's not what I'm saying at all, because this is a common objection by most of the pre-tribbers that disagree with me on this. They say that the rapture and the church weren't yet revealed, so it can't be in Matthew 24. But I would remind you that Jesus had already begun planting what I like to call seed doctrine related to the church and his second advent as a whole. In fact, only 8 chapters earlier in Matthew 16, Jesus had begun to already discuss the church by name. He called it by name. And further, only 2 days after the Olivet Discourse, he would then very clearly speak about the pre-trib rapture in John 14, which is what we call the upper room discourse. And the same pre-tribbers that would disagree with me have no trouble acknowledging the pre-trib rapture in that discourse. And so then there's really no argument against the idea that here also in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus is beginning to plant the seeds of doctrines that would later, as his own ministry and then the rest of the New Testament gets written, would gradually become clear. In other words, like any good teacher, Jesus incrementally teaches these new truths, knowing that they wouldn't be able to fully understand them yet at that moment. At that time, he didn't expect them to have some kind of fully developed understanding of what it was, the church or the rapture. That would get revealed later in its fullness by the Apostle Paul, who would build on these seed teachings of Jesus, as I'll call them, and fully expound on these things. But at this point, Jesus was simply teaching that at the beginning of what we call eschatology, or the end times, or the broad period of the day of the Lord, or the parousia, as he describes it there, using that word in the Greek in Matthew 24 here, meaning the presence or the coming of the Lord, right? The second coming. He was just trying to convey that the righteous on the earth at this time are going to be rescued and removed immediately prior to the beginning of judgment. That's all he expected them to understand at that point. And there's many solid exegetical reasons that I think actually, as I said before, demand this understanding. And these reasons have been put forward by top-level pre-trib scholars, people like Dr. John Hart, Dr. Robert L. Thomas, a number of others. And these aren't nobodies. These are some of the top New Testament Greek scholars of our time. Dr. Robert L. Thomas wrote what I think is the best 2-volume commentary on Revelation that's ever been written, and it's not even close. If you're building your library collection, you really need to add it, I think for sure. And so I'm going to share with you today 7 reasons why the pre-trib rapture is in Matthew 24. And the sum total of all these 7 reasons, when taken together as a whole, I think is undeniable. I think it's an absolute certainty. But these evidences are not only useful for convincing current pre-trib believers to accept the pre-trib rapture as being in Matthew 24, but it's also going to act as very decisive evidence against every other rapture view. Because again, these evidences require a pre-trib view when understood together. You'll see what we mean as we continue. And in fact, I'm going to show you that the later New Testament authors, people like John and Peter and James and Paul, very clearly understood the Olivet Discourse in this way, the way that I'm going to explain to you today, because they utilize the same exact expressions and the same exact language that Jesus did in this discourse when they then go and write their own later epistles. And they very clearly apply this same language to the rapture in an undebatable way in many, if not all of the instances when you connect it all. And so really the lesson is, if they understood Jesus in Matthew 24 that way, then we must also, obviously. We'll see that the New Testament really does a great job of self-interpreting, which should be the final nail in the coffin for anyone that denies the pre-trib rapture in Matthew 24. I'm going to show you this is how the later New Testament authors, like the ones I just mentioned, interpreted it. It's actually pretty undeniable when you look at it. And so I think the body of evidence here is absolutely indisputable. I don't think it's that debatable, guys. And I want to share it with you today. Let me say that also, apart from the scholarly community, I think most regular Christians who are not theologians, who simply read the discourse, while maybe not understanding all of it in great detail, I think do read certain parts of its passages and just inherently know it's talking about the rapture. The language is so clear, and people have always seen it this way. When we see things like no man knows the day or the hour, or all the exhortations to watch for the Lord because he can come at any time, and the parables comparing his coming to a thief in the night, and then not to mention the idea of one being taken and another being left behind, which left behind is the exact same language that pre-tribbers of every kind always use to describe those who are not taken in the rapture. So I think most people that simply read those statements just sort of naturally believe right away that it's speaking of the rapture there. But what ends up happening to many of these people is that they get later told by certain pre-trib teachers that they're incorrect about this, and that the rapture is actually not in this chapter at all. Well, again, I'm going to try to show you today that yes, if you were this kind of person, your initial perceptions were correct. You may not have been able to fully understand or explain every nuance of that chapter, but your initial understanding was correct. It is the pre-trib rapture. And so without further ado, let's jump right into this because it's going to be a very long video. We have lots to talk about. Now, the first thing that needs to be discussed before I get into the 7 reasons is some foundational background information or context information on the Olivet Discourse itself as a whole, and some unique features that are within it. So, as most of us know, the discourse is motivated by several questions that the disciples posed to Jesus while they're walking past the Jewish temple. The temple was a massive structure that was built on some just enormous stones. It was built with incredible precision, and really hard to believe that they were even able to do that back at that time. And the disciples were pointing out the grandeur of it to Jesus, how it was constructed using these incredible stones. And he surprised them by saying, actually, it's all going to be torn down stone by stone. And he predicted its total destruction, much to their surprise. And the disciples responded by posing several questions about this. And because of how long I know that this video is going to take, I really can't devote the time to get fully into every aspect of this. But if you look back to an earlier video of mine called the Olivet Discourse, Deciphering the Dilemma, you can get more of a full explanation on some of the details about what I'm basically going to summarize for you very quickly right now. So the disciples basically asked 2 questions then. And the 2 questions are essentially based on the premise of their own assumptions as trained Jews in the Old Testament, that the temple's destruction happens at the end of the world or the end of the age, or related to the day of the Lord in its broad sense, or what we today might call the end times, the time period of eschatology. And we can see that context very clearly demonstrated in the questions they ask Jesus, as you'll see. They ask first, when will these things be? Or when will these things take place, in other words? So it's a when question. And then secondly, they ask, and what will be the sign of your coming? And the Greek word here is parousia, for coming. So what will be the sign of your parousia and of the end of the age? So it's sort of a 2-part question, but it's really one question. What will be the sign of your parousia and the end of the age? Since in their minds, the known assumption was that the parousia is an end of the age event, and they were correct. And so this is a what question. What is the sign? So it's a when and a what. So basically, the disciples associated the temple's destruction with an end times event that would happen when the Messiah returns, but they didn't know how soon they should expect his return. So they ask him when it will be. Again, a when question. And they also ask about the signs that are related to that time period of the parousia, or the signs of the broad day of the Lord. So they ask him then the what question. And this is important. In fact, it's essential really to understand this because it forms the outline for understanding the construction of the discourse. You'll see what I mean in a second. And because of that, it helps us understand context. Or in other words, if we know what portion of the discourse pertains to which question, then that helps us understand the context of what Jesus is actually referring to in each of those sections within the framework that we now understand as people in the church age who have had the privilege of reading the rest of the New Testament. Now, obviously, the people back at that time who were listening to this discourse by Jesus wouldn't have had that privilege yet. They were just receiving these new revelations piece by piece. And they couldn't put all the pieces yet together yet like we can today. And we shouldn't expect that they would have. Jesus was planting, again, what I like to call seed doctrine. And his point wasn't for anyone to fully understand a rapture of the church in the way that we think of today. I want everyone to understand that, especially since the church wasn't even yet revealed in all of its fullness. Jesus did mention it. He did start to already plant seed doctrine, but it wasn't yet revealed in all of its fullness. All right. So remember, Jesus did mention the church by name already back in chapter 16. So he was already planting seed doctrines concerning the church. But we shouldn't take that to mean that everyone was supposed to understand that there's this intervening time period between the 69th and the 70th weeks of the Daniel 9:24 to 27 prophecy, Israel's timeline, and that the church is this intercalation into that. They didn't have that full understanding yet. But the point is that even here in Matthew 24, he's also planting seed doctrines that later, especially in light of the Pauline epistles, these doctrines would begin to take full form and begin to, I'll say, germinate, using the analogy of a plant, and be more readily understandable. And I say that right now, just so you, again, don't get the false impression that I'm saying Jesus was teaching full out rapture doctrine here and church age truths that he expected everyone to understand. No, he was planting seeds that would be able to be fully understood later. We'll talk about that more as we go. But going back to the context part here, we're understanding when in the discourse, Jesus answers each of the two questions that were posed by the disciples, that helps us to understand context. So actually what we find is that Matthew employs what's called a chiasm here. It's actually quite common in Matthew's gospel that he uses this kind of chiastic structuring. Now, a chiasm is something that's used in literature where two or more concepts are presented or repeated in reverse order. And so Jesus answers the disciples' second question first, and then their first question second. So he first answers their second question, their what question. Remember, what are the signs of your coming and the end of the age? And that answer is recorded in the first half of the discourse. That would be verses 4 through 35. And then in verse 36, he begins to transition into the latter half of the discourse to now begin to answer their first question, their when question. When will these things be? This is going to be very clear as we continue. We're going to keep hitting on this. So the discourse is organized, or it's structured as a chiasm. Everyone got that? And to be honest, that's really the whole key to understanding the discourse. Everything flows from that. If you just understand that, everything else is going to fall into place very neatly. It gives order and an organized sort of outline to make the discourse understandable, to make it logical, to have a logical, organized flow to it that we can understand. And what I find is that everyone who's confused about this discourse or who's misinterpreting the context, they're all people who are just simply unaware of or don't accept what I just explained. It's very simple, but it's the key that really unlocks comprehension here. So we're dividing Jesus's discourse into two parts, a first half and a latter half. Again, the first half is from verse 4 until verse 35. And the latter half begins at verse 36 and then really continues even into chapter 25. And it ends at, let's say, verse 13 of chapter 25. So you're going to have a great understanding of this discourse by the end of this teaching. That I promise you. Now, the last thing that I just want to point out here before we go on is that in verses 4 through 35, Jesus explains the what. What are the signs? He answers their question about the what. He explains it as a sequence of signs that all take place. Now, this is very important, during the broad day of the Lord, not before it, guys, not during the church age. He's not talking about stuff that we're expected to see now, but during the day of the Lord. And I could easily prove this to you, and I do it in other videos where I go very in depth on it. You can look back to a very early video of mine called Are We Seeing the Birth Pangs?, where I show that biblically, the answer is very clearly no. The birth pangs begin when the day of the Lord, in its broad sense, suddenly initiates. Or in other words, when the parousia begins, when the rapture happens. And the judgments of the broad day then immediately begin to fall on those who are left behind. That's the beginning of the broad day. And that's what Jesus mentions here in verses 4-8 as being the beginning of birth pang signs. And like I said, there's a very easy proof that these are not happening now and that they occur in the broad day of the Lord. So come to 1 Thessalonians 5:2-3, and it says this: "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them as travail or birth pangs upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape." Okay, so notice what Paul says here, the day of the Lord, and he's referring to the broad sense, not the climactic sense at the end of the tribulation. He's referring to the broad sense, which begins this entire period, which is when the parousia starts, which is when the rapture happens, which he had just referred to at the end of the previous chapter. That was where he talked about the rapture, which is his entire context here. It continues into chapter 5. And we'll actually come back to make this even clearer further ahead in the video. But anyway, so he says that the broad day of the Lord commences basically, or comes, initiates. He's talking about the absolute beginning of this entire period, guys. He's talking about its absolute beginning. It comes, begins, initiates, starts suddenly as a thief in the night, meaning suddenly, signlessly, without warning, imminently. And he says that out of a setting where people are expecting peace and safety, or in other words, out of a time of really routine normalcy or relative calm, then suddenly, out of nowhere, without warning, the destruction, the judgments of the beginning of the broad day begin as travail or birth pangs begin upon a woman who's entering labor. So just as the birth pangs start suddenly, that's how the day of the Lord comes. It begins suddenly. So he's talking about the absolute beginning of a long period. And Paul uses the same Greek word for travail or birth pangs as Jesus uses in Matthew 24, verse 8, when he says the beginning of birth pangs, the Greek word odin. So very clearly, they're talking about the same thing. So they're saying the broad day begins suddenly with the first birth pang judgments that suddenly, unexpectedly begin to fall on those who are left behind on the earth immediately after the righteous are removed, which again, Paul had just talked about at the end of chapter 4, which is how he so easily transitions here into chapter 5, where he's now talking about the timing. We'll talk about that more. But that was the entire context for this continued teaching into chapter 5. So Paul and Jesus both agree. But now a third confirmation of this is that the beginning of birth pang signs that Jesus mentions here in Matthew 24 align perfectly to the sealed judgments mentioned in Revelation 6, which obviously are the beginning judgments of the broad day of the Lord. Now, those obviously are not happening right now. And so there's three very clear witnesses that all support what I'm telling you, that the beginning of birth pangs are the beginning of the broad day of the Lord that's mentioned here by Jesus in verses 4-8 in the Olivet Discourse. And then after mentioning the beginning of the birth pang signs, Jesus then goes on to discuss the other signs in sequence that take place during this period. He eventually speaks of the abomination of desolation, which we know happens at the midpoint of the tribulation. And then he eventually ends this period of time by saying that immediately after the end of the tribulation, or after the end of the judgment phase of the broad day of the Lord, he physically returns and the whole earth sees him coming. And then it speaks about how the angels conduct the final worldwide regathering of Israel from all the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, with the great trump being blown, which, if you know your Old Testament, is a very obvious, very clear reference to several passages in Isaiah and other places. You can go ahead and look these up: Isaiah 27:12-13, Isaiah 11:11-12, and many other Old Testament prophecies that also speak of this. And Jesus then uses a parable about the budding of a fig tree, or as it's recorded in Luke's version, he says, or all of the trees. So it's not even just referring to the fig tree. It just refers to the concept of the budding of a fruit tree in general, to summarize this answer to their second question about the signs. That simply when you see the tree budding, you know that summer is coming, where you're going to see the fullness of the fruit come out on the tree. And in the same way, he says that when you see these signs that he just described to you, this whole sequence, the beginning of the birth pang signs, the tribulation signs, etc., you can know his coming in the clouds, which is the final sign after the tribulation of those days, or at the end of that tribulation, is now predictable and to be expected. And he says the generation that sees the beginning of the birth pang signs is the same generation that's going to see the final sign of him coming in the sky at the end of the tribulation. It's that simple. It all happens within a generation. It doesn't exceed one generation. The same generation is going to see all of these things. In other words, Jesus limits that entire time frame to one generation. And then after that, the discourse transitions into verse 36. And I took all the time to explain this so that you have that context in mind going into our first reason number one. And I'm sure that you guys can now tell that this is going to be a pretty long video because we're now just starting the 7 reasons. But I'll try not to go too in the weeds for each one of these. This is going to be the first of the 7 reasons why what we know today as the pre-trib rapture is in Matthew 24. And as you'll see, I'm saying it's in the latter half of the discourse, verses 36 through 25:13. So the first reason is the fact that the discourse has 2 contrasting halves. And this is obviously based on the outline of the discourse that I just explained, based on the 2 questions of the disciples. Now, the contrast means the context shifts. That's what it means. As it goes from the first half to the latter half, there's a notable shift in context. I'm going to show you this contrast in great detail. Now, the first half of the discourse in verses 4 through 35 is all about signs. You can't miss it. It's the entire thing. It's all about signs, predictability. This is how you do know things. While the latter half, beginning at verse 36, transitions to being all about the absence of signs, that there are no signs. It's all about unpredictability, that nobody can know. And so this again helps us understand that Jesus is speaking about different contexts here. Now, it's a related context. It's all concerning the Parousia, or the day of the Lord, but it focuses on different aspects of the Parousia, or of the day of the Lord. And this is easily understood when we recognize that the Parousia is a period of time. It's not a momentary event. That's where people go wrong on this. The Parousia begins when the broad day begins, which is when the rapture takes place. You got to get this. This is his Parousia, or his coming for the saints. But then the Parousia continues until the end of the tribulation, where he appears in a visible way with his saints coming back with him. The Bible speaks clearly of both his return for the church, which begins this period, and his return to execute judgment then at the end of the tribulation, as all being referred to as his Parousia. It's all one period of time. And I have older videos on this. There's one entitled simply The Parousia, where I give a number of scholarly quotes that say exactly this, just so you don't think it's something crazy that I just made up. You know, top scholars like the late Dr. John Walvoord and many others are going to tell you this. And so this recognition that the Parousia is a period of time, not just an instantaneous event, it's a period of time that has different aspects to it, allows us to not be confused at why then this Olivet Discourse, which is all about his Parousia, can have a first half that's all about signs and predictability, which Jesus says allows them to know it's near, while the latter half is all about the lack of any signs to let you know the Parousia is near. And that nobody, even the angels of heaven, even the Son, Jesus himself, can't know the timing. It's completely contrasting. It's a direct contrast. It's completely opposite. If the Parousia was just a single momentary event, then this contrast is nothing more than a huge contradiction. But if the Parousia is an extended period of time, then it's obvious that the latter half of the discourse is speaking of the unpredictability of the absolute beginning of this period as a whole. While the first half, then, of course, is speaking of the sequence of very observable signs that are going to take place once the period begins, and that continue in sequence all the way until its culmination, when at the end, then he physically returns visibly in the sky to bring judgment at the end of this period, the end of the tribulation. And that you can use those signs that he just described to understand and predict the nearness of that event, the climactic aspect of his parousia, not the beginning. So in other words, the fact that the discourse so blatantly contradicts itself, as it seems, signs versus no signs, predictability versus unpredictability, prophetic prerequisite signs versus imminence, it's proof in itself that it's speaking of a different aspect of the extended period called the parousia. Okay? The beginning of the parousia versus the climax or the ending of it, or really all throughout it, climaxing in the end. So the beginning is described as being unpredictable, completely sudden, and completely signless or imminent. It can happen at any time. There's no signs. It's just simply overhead, just kind of waiting to begin. There's nothing that needs to happen first. It can just happen at any time, taking everyone off guard by surprise. While on the other hand, the climactic ending of the parousia is totally predictable, since the period itself is full of the signs that Jesus described. And since Daniel and Revelation and even other passages, but really Daniel and Revelation in most detail, timing detail, tell us how long the tribulation is, the tribulation being a subset within the parousia. So it allows you to count down to the end of it. It gives you certain time markers. We know what begins the tribulation also, which we know the tribulation 7 years, and we know that we know what ends it. We know what takes place at the midpoint. All of this is completely predictable. And so let's look a bit deeper at this then to really begin to see this clearly. So if you read through the first half of the discourse, again, you'll see it's all about signs. The entire focus is on signs in answer to the disciples' second question about the signs of his parousia and the end of the age. And so Jesus details all the signs that are going to take place during the period of the parousia that culminate in his physical coming in the sky at the end of the age, at the end of the tribulation, at the end of the parousia, at the end of the judgment phase of the broad day of the Lord. And you see phrases in this first half of the discourse like, when you see all these things, all these signs, know that it is near. You can see that in verse 33. And then the fig tree parable, where the whole point of it is that you can know. When the branch puts forth its leaves, you know. The whole point is that you can know because of the signs. It's entirely predictable. And he just described how the sequence goes so it can be known. That's the whole point. It is knowable. It's all about observable things that give direct knowledge and predictability. But then in verse 36 and following, the context abruptly shifts to the total opposite. His parousia, referring to, again, the absolute beginning of that period as a whole, is totally signless and sudden and unpredictable and coming without warning. And therefore, it's something that you have to continue to actively watch for. You're not watching for signs. Please get this. You are not watching for signs today because there are none. That's his whole point in the latter half of the discourse here. What does he say to watch for? He says you have to continually watch for him himself, which Jesus himself interprets for us. He says watching means be ye ready. Please get this. Watching does not mean watching for some kind of signs. It doesn't mean physical watching for signs. It means be ye ready. And so watching is an idiom for spiritual readiness, spiritual preparation, being in a spiritual condition, which we call being saved when he comes, and making sure that you're about his business while you're waiting. And some of the parables then speak about, we'll talk about watching in more detail later in this video, but the parables then speak about this. They're all based on the premise of imminence. And so all through this latter half, the entire theme is there are no signs. There is no predictability. We see this constantly repeated, guys. It's the entire point. You cannot miss this. Verse 36, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. Verse 42, ye know not what hour. Verse 44, in such an hour as ye think not. Verse 50, an hour he is not aware of. Chapter 25, verse 13, ye know neither the day nor the hour. It means total unpredictability. And all of this provides clear support for why we can understand the first half of the discourse to have nothing at all to do with the pre-trib rapture, since the context is all about signs during the parousia, during the broad day. And this also means that no mid-trib or post-trib rapture could possibly be getting described by verses 36 and following then in this latter half, since it all completely contradicts any context during that time period, since it all depends completely on the total absence of signs. And it supports then why the pre-trib rapture, which is always spoken of in the scriptures as being imminent, meaning sudden, signless, unpredictable, without warning, can happen at any time, fits in exactly with the tone of the latter half of the discourse, which again is all about this kind of a context. And it speaks of the absolute beginning of the parousia, which is the absolute beginning point of the broad period of the day of the Lord, which is when pre-tribbers understand that the rapture takes place. We don't enter into this time period. We don't see any of these judgments. We don't see any of these signs. They're not for us. That's what being a pre-trib believer means. We aren't expecting to see any of those things. And furthermore, this is the only context in all of eschatology that can be described in this way as being imminent, sudden, signless, without warning, can happen at any moment. Think about that. The absolute beginning point of the broad period of the day of the Lord, or the absolute beginning point of the parousia of Christ, when the rapture happens, that is the only point in all of eschatology that can be described as imminent, sudden, signless, etc. Nothing after that can be described that way, because as soon as we're gone, that's when the signs begin, and it's all full of signs after that point. That's Jesus's whole point, that after that, everything becomes very predictable. And so that description, which is made extremely clear by Jesus, this description of imminence really can only fit one context. So that means there cannot be a mid-trib or a post-trib rapture, because nothing after the Perusian broad day begins can be considered signless, sudden, imminent, etc. It's entirely full of signs. I hope you guys are getting this. It's full of predictability. You can only be taken off guard suddenly by the absolute beginning of that period. That's the only time that can come without warning, because that's when the warning begins. That's when the signs begin. That's when the judgments begin. Nothing after that can take you by surprise, because it's already started. You're already in it, and you're stuck in it. So once it begins, that context of imminence and suddenness dissipates immediately, never to come back. The element of surprise goes out the window. Nothing can be sudden again once the signs begin. Remember, sudden and signs are opposites, complete opposites. Nothing that's sudden can have signs. And if something has an entire sequence of described, prophesied, observable signs, like what Jesus described in the first half of the discourse, then the event that those signs point towards cannot be sudden. This should be very obvious. So this context of imminence can only fit one specific time in the chronology of the end times. I'm sorry for maybe overbeating this point, but it's very important, and people are overlooking this. It can only fit one time and can only be satisfied by a pre-trib rapture, along with a simultaneous beginning of the broad day of the Lord context, which is the absolute beginning point of what we call the end times. After it begins, imminence is gone goodbye. I hope you're all following this. So that's the first reason that the pre-trib rapture has to be in the Olivet Discourse. It's the only thing that can satisfy that description because of that context. And that reason all by itself, I think, is very compelling without even considering the next reasons, because it's built on correctly understanding the context and the flow of the discourse itself. It comes from the text itself. I'll say that I really don't think a person can understand this discourse at all outside of a recognition of how the two halves contrast one another and how the first half answers the second question of the disciples and the latter half answers the first question. I think understanding that first is the foundation. It's fundamental to then being able to correctly interpret the passage. It's the framework, guys. All right, so moving on now to reason number 2, and this involves the transitional nature of a Greek phrase called peri-dei. This is the phrase that translates as now concerning or but of, that we see, of course, in verse 36, which begins that second half of the discourse. Again, that's where we're saying the discourse switches context. And this phrase in the Greek absolutely supports that shift. And that's probably an understatement, to be honest. Peri-dei is often used to facilitate a shift in focus, or at least a shift to a new aspect of the foregoing context. Oftentimes to reach back to previous material in the conversation, things that were previously stated or mentioned, to now address an unanswered or unaddressed aspect, which is exactly what's happening right here. It's used right after Jesus finishes discussing the sequence of Day of the Lord signs in the first half of the discourse, again, of course, to answer the disciples' what question, and now he's transitioning to answer their when question, which is why he now pivots to fully focus on the timing aspect, the timing of the absolute beginning point of the period of his parousia. Again, the opening of the broad day of the Lord, which is when we know the pre-trib rapture takes place. And this is what he says, but of, which is peri-dei, or now concerning, that day and hour, or in other words, now concerning, or I'm switching now to discuss the issue of the timing. Now regarding the timing, nobody knows, right? He says, regarding that day and hour, knoweth no man. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So he's basically saying, I already answered your second question about the what, but now concerning the timing aspect, which was your first question, the when question, well, the answer is that nobody can know it. It's very simple. It's sudden, it's unpredictable. Even the angels can't know it. So stop trying to predict it. Stop trying to think that you can figure it out. Even the Son didn't know it. None of you guys on any of your channels are going to figure out the time of the rapture, I promise, because Jesus promised it right here. And this peri-dei construction in the Greek here in Matthew 24 is not, again, it's not something I'm making up. This has been noted by many top scholars and teachers, men like Dr. Robert L. Thomas, again, Dr. John Hart, Arnold Fruchtenbaum even, and others. I could share with you so many quotes on this, but I'm going to just give you one from Dr. Thomas. And he says this: the day from peri-dei that begins verse 36 must be transitional because the 36th verse changes the discussion of signs preceding the coming to now emphasize that no signs will precede the parousia. Peri-dei is a frequent device for introducing a change from one phase of a subject to another phase of the same subject, or from one subject to another. Now, what's interesting, though, is Paul also does the exact same thing, and he's speaking of the same context. It's found in 1 Thessalonians. I'm going to show you this. Now, of course, when he wrote, there was no chapter breaks. Men added those later. So for him, it was just one flowing narrative from the end of chapter 4. We mentioned this before, where he speaks about the rapture, and he calls it the harpazo, verses 13 to 18. We all know it. He was explaining an aspect that they were unfamiliar with, which was what happens to the dead in Christ at that time. But then as he continues to what we now call chapter 5, he's speaking of the same context, but he switches very slightly to address a different aspect of it. He pivots to now address something that they already did know about, which was the timing aspect, which he said they already knew was unpredictable and unknowable. And he uses all the same language that Jesus uses in Matthew 24, referring to it as coming like a thief, which is exactly what Jesus says. And Paul says nobody will know the times and the seasons, just like Jesus says nobody knows the day or hour. And Paul says the day of the Lord will begin suddenly, exactly what Jesus said, that it begins unpredictably and suddenly like a snare without warning. And Paul also says it initiates like the sudden beginning of birth pangs, like Jesus also said, and even used the same Greek word Odin, like I mentioned before. And Paul even said that it arises out of a time of routine normalcy when people are expecting peace and safety, which again is what Jesus also said, that people are buying and selling and marrying and giving in marriage, and they're caught up in the routine normalcy of regular life. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, it just happens. It's all identical, guys. It's the same exact context. Paul got this from Jesus. And so the obvious conclusion is that Paul also got this peri-day transition and all of this identical information from Matthew 24. In Matthew, Jesus first goes from what they can know through the observable signs to then what they cannot know because it's unpredictable. That's what we just talked about. He goes from the what to the when. Well, look at what Paul does here. He does the reverse, where he first addresses what they didn't know. He talks about an aspect that they weren't familiar with, and then he moved to what they already did know. And he also went from a what to a when. I hope you guys are seeing this. It's completely parallel. He first addressed what happens at the rapture, that aspect that they didn't know about, and then he moved to the when, or the timing aspect, the times and the seasons, which he says they already did know. They already knew about that. They already knew that it's unpredictable. It's sudden. It comes without warning. And so this further supports what I'm presenting, that both Jesus and Paul do this while speaking about the exact context. The only context, in fact, as I said before, where imminence can fit, which is where we place the pre-trib rapture in the chronology of the end times, right at the absolute beginning. So that's our number 2. Okay, reason number 3, Jesus' use of the phrase that day and hour. Right after using the peri-day, Jesus then immediately refers to the phrase that day and hour. He says, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. Now, up until now in the discourse, meaning verse 36 where it transitions, Jesus had used the expression those days in the plural. And we see that in verses like verse 19, verse 22, verse 29. But he now transitions to use the expression that day, singular, which also supports the idea that verse 36, as supported by the peri-day, is transitional in nature. And why does he refer to it as that day in the singular? Because he's speaking of the broad period of the day of the Lord as a singular unit, as a whole. He's speaking of the absolute beginning of that whole period. And it's how the Old Testament prophets often spoke of it, the eschatological day of the Lord. Guys, you can see this. Look back to passages like Ezekiel 30, verse 3 and verse 9, Joel chapter 3, verse 14 and verse 18, Zephaniah 1, 7 to 15, and many others. It's speaking of that day as a singular period of time, which makes it clear then that when Jesus does this, this is a nod back to the prophets. He's speaking of the absolute beginning of the arrival of that day, of that period as a whole, just like they did, which the disciples would have understood because they had the Old Testament. They were familiar with this. Now, further, another thing I want to point out is that this mention of the day to mean the eschatological day of the Lord is also found in the New Testament. In fact, in the passage we just looked at in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, this is yet another commonality between what Paul wrote there and then what Jesus had said in Matthew 24, because Paul uses that day, the Greek word hemera in verse 4, to refer to the imminent, sudden, signless, unpredictable beginning of the eschatological day of the Lord in its broad sense. Remember, he says, "But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief." And remember, his context here goes all the way back to what he had said about the rapture in 4:13 to 18. It's all the same time period that he's talking about, the absolute beginning of what we call eschatology, which is why he can then flow right into the discussion of the timing in chapter 5 so very naturally. The rapture happens as the opening event of the broad day, the opening of the Perusia. You got to notice Jesus and Paul are saying the exact same thing about the exact same context and the exact same moment in time, that future time when the broad day initiates and the righteous are removed via the rapture, and eschatological judgment then immediately begins to fall on those who are left behind. So let me share a quote with you about this by Dr. John Hart. And he says exactly this about what we're talking about. He writes this: "If the phrase 'that day and hour' that Jesus said refers to the surprise arrival of the day of the Lord, as Paul defined it in 1 Thessalonians 5, then the coming of that day and hour takes place at the very same time as the pre-tribulational rapture. This is because both the rapture and the day of the Lord are described as pre-tribulational and imminent. Both are also illustrated by the thief in the night imagery, an imminent event. Matthew 24:43 and Luke 12:39 to 40, with 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 2 Peter 3:10. Now, let me take this even further. We spoke about that day from Jesus' usage of that day and hour. But let's now talk about the word hour, the Greek word ora. Now, this too refers to the eschatological broad day of the Lord, which church age believers are told that they're going to be kept from, as we know, via the rapture. And we can see this in, for instance, Revelation 3:10, which says, "Because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I also will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the earth, to try them that dwell upon the earth." Now, when John here is writing the words of Jesus, the hour of temptation, it's speaking of eschatological judgment. It's speaking about the judgment of the day of the Lord, which shall come upon all the world. Church age believers here are promised, of course, a pre-tribulation rapture, basically as a mode of rescue to remove us from the earth so that we avoid experiencing the judgment of that time, because it says it's going to happen to all those who are on the earth. And so again, all of these evidences confirm the case that the beginning of the broad day of the Lord is in view in Matthew 24:36, which is when the pre-trib rapture takes place. And let me also share with you another great quote. This is from Dr. Thomas, and he just summarizes this, I think, so perfectly. Speaking about how verse 36 transitions to now refer to the beginning of the broad day, not the end of the tribulation, as had previously been discussed by Jesus at the end of the first half of the discourse. He says this: "Here, verse 36, he indicates the complete unexpectedness of what will overtake the world at the time of the beginning of the broad day. He changes the subject from the signs that indicate the nearness of his coming to establish the kingdom in 24:32 to 35 to now speak of events which will have no signals to indicate that the advent is at the door." In other words, 24:36 speaks of a different arrival from the arrival signaled by all these things, twice referred to in connection with the parable of the fig tree in 24:32 to 34. After 24:36, Jesus looks at the events of the broad day of the Lord as a whole, and how the beginning of that broad day will catch everyone by surprise, with no indication that it's at the door. Jesus illustrated the complete unexpectedness of the series of events by noting the parallel of his coming to inflict wrath on the world with the way God caught the world by surprise with the flood in Noah's day, 24:37 to 39. The victims did not know about it until the flood happened. That will be the case when the Son of Man returns, the Perusia, or the beginning of the broad day. The world will not know until the period is underway. They will have no warnings such as those alluded to in the parable of the fig tree. All right, let's move on now to reason number 4, Jesus' usage of the days of Noah example. This is something that people grossly misunderstand and overlook. Now, it's something that we've already briefly mentioned at a couple of points throughout the video, but I really want to make sure that everyone really grasps just how convincing of an argument this is in favor of what I'm trying to present. Now, those who disagree with me on the point that the context shifts in verse 36 and reverts back to the beginning of the Parousia, or broad day as a whole, have to answer this context problem that they're creating for themselves, probably without knowing it. Guys, you got to get this. They're creating problems. They're not solving them by taking the position that Jesus's description of this casual, sort of carefree, business as usual kind of attitude of people that exists right prior to the Parousia can in any way have to do with the context right before the end of the tribulation. They're conflating those two things. They don't fit, because that's what they're saying. They think verse 36 and following all just continued the ongoing context from before, where Jesus just described his physical return at the end of the tribulation. And they're thinking that these next verses that follow it, such as here where Jesus uses the Noah example, they think refers to the end of the tribulation, immediately right before Christ's second coming proper, the end of the Parousia, the climax. But what I'm going to continue to show you here is that such a view is completely and utterly divorced from everything the Bible tells us about the context on planet Earth immediately before the end of the tribulation. Please get this. So I just mentioned all of that as an introduction to this reason number 4, just to set the table for you. We're going to talk more about this as we go, so that now when we get to talk about how Jesus uses the days of Noah as, get this, a further explanation of the statement that he had just made, that nobody can know or predict the time of the Parousia, you're going to catch right on. So let's take a look at this passage. I'm going to start with the previous verse so that you can see how it flows right into it and says the exact same thing about the exact same context, how it's a further expansion, a further explanation of what Jesus had just said. I'm actually going to read even forward into the next thing that Jesus says, which we're going to come back to later, about one taken and one left. And the reason that I'm going to do that is because it's also a further expansion of this same message. And you're going to be able to see and notice that the ultimate message and conclusion of all these examples, which is the call to eschatological watchfulness for the Lord himself, since the timing is unknown, that's the whole point. You'll see. Okay, here we go. Starting at verse 36, it says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Now, notice how he continues right into the mention of the Noah example. It's a further expansion of what he just said. He's using it to say the same thing. He says, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Notice he continues now. He gives a further expansion of this. "Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken, and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken, and the other left. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come." He again repeats the same thing. He ties it up in a nice bow, letting you know that all of that stuff goes together. It's all an expansion of the same thing. It's all saying, communicating the same message. So let's go back and talk about this a little bit. So verses 37 to 39, we can see that Jesus brings up the days of Noah. As I said, a further elaboration of what he had just said about the unpredictability, the suddenness, the signlessness, or the imminence of his Parousia in verse 36. So since he's very clearly using it as a further example of what he already just tried to communicate, or as a further illustration of that, then that has to guide and limit our interpretation of why he used the Noah example. What's his purpose of doing it? As if that wasn't completely obvious already just by reading the text. But a lot of people want to ignore the actual text, and they want to insert colorful meanings about the Nephilim and about other things that have absolutely nothing to do with Jesus's intention here. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. The clear point is that the coming of the Parousia will be like the days of Noah, where before the flood, people were engaged in normal routineness of life, activities of life like eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage. And like we also see Jesus saying in a parallel passage in Luke 17, buying and selling, planting and reaping until the day Noah entered the ark. Or in other words, until the righteous were removed to safety. And then suddenly, immediately, that same day, the judgment began to fall on those who were left behind, taking them completely off guard. That's how the Parousia starts. That's how the beginning of the broad day will initiate, is what Jesus is saying. That's the example, that's the equivalence that he's making. It initiates with the sudden removal of the righteous to safety and the immediate judgment on the wicked world who are left behind to enter the judgment, which is going to sweep all them away. And it occurs without warning, out of a time period of routine normalcy when nobody was expecting it. And even the righteous couldn't predict it. The righteous may be expecting it, but not at any particular moment in time. They have to continually watch for it. Nobody can predict it. The unrighteous, they were taken completely off guard. They didn't even know it's coming. Now, let's stop for a second to realize something about this context. Nothing at all of what I just said can describe the end of the tribulation. That's the point. That context just doesn't fit. It's actually the total opposite. That time, during the judgment phase of the day of the Lord, the climax of it, during the tribulation, cannot in any way be described as life as usual. Why? Well, obviously, of course, because by very definition, the tribulation, and really the whole judgment phase of the day of the Lord, is the most intense period of distress and judgment and wrath that the world has ever experienced or ever will. In fact, Jesus actually said this himself right in verse 21. He said this, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be." So it's completely incompatible then. Nothing about this can be confused with a context of life as usual. It's anything but. There could not be a more polar opposite, guys. Now, furthermore, nothing about the end of the tribulation is sudden or can take anyone off guard. Again, it's the culmination of a series of prophetic signs, which Jesus just talked about. There's nothing unknown. There's nothing unpredictable. There's nothing sudden about it to anybody. And there's no imminent, signless, sudden removal of righteous people at the end of the tribulation. That can't fit either. Nothing, literally nothing about this context is compatible. Also, it can't be said that the wicked people on earth at that time know nothing about what's happening. Guys, just read your Bible on this. To the contrary, look at Revelation. It specifically, very clearly tells us repeatedly that the wicked people on earth during this phase of judgment know exactly what's happening. They're actually expecting the return of the Lord to such a degree that they're preparing to do battle with him when he does come. Guys, please think about this. There's no element of surprise anywhere. There's nobody being taken off guard. There's nobody clueless about what's happening at that time, as the Noah example and the surrounding verses, as I said, require. No, it's the opposite. The only time period in all of eschatology that can satisfy this context of imminence and suddenness and signlessness, unpredictability, is exactly what I've been telling you. It's the beginning of the Parousia, when the rapture happens, as the church age ends, and the broad day just suddenly initiates. Because the righteous are removed to safety, just like in this example, Noah's family was, while simultaneously the wicked who are left behind then begin to face immediate judgment. That sequence of judgments in the broad day of the Lord that take them completely off guard. And then as those judgments begin and that sequence continues, then nothing after that period begins can catch anyone off guard because it's a continuous sequence of judgments. They're already in the judgments, with one following right after the next. Only the absolute beginning can come without warning on a population that's unsuspecting. And this context is also obvious in Jesus's very clear mention of the one taken and the one left, who were doing those same activities of daily routineness that Jesus had just mentioned, where the world is oblivious to what's about to happen. Think about it. It's two men working in the field, just like Jesus said, planting and reaping, two women grinding at the mill, activities of daily life. They have no clue. But to drive this point home with reason number 4, I really want to read to you a quote. This is kind of a long quote, but it's by Dr. John Hart, and it's excellent. He just absolutely nails it. So I really want you to pay attention to this. And if you're one of the people who tries to say this is referring to the end of the tribulation, these statements of Jesus here in Matthew 24, again, if you're not convinced yet, please just listen as I read this quote to you. It's not compatible, guys. You've got to face this. Okay, he says this: how can a business as usual attitude toward life exist at the precise time when the 21 tribulation judgments are being poured out in all their intensity? Instead, the most transparent meaning of the days of Noah illustration is that just as normal but unsuspecting lifestyles existed prior to the great judgment of the flood, so too normal but unsuspecting lifestyles will exist prior to the sudden onslaught of the day of the Lord judgments and the rapture of the church. In the Noah parallel, the people knew nothing, verse 39 in the NIV and NET, about what was soon to happen until the flood came and took them all away. If the flood judgment illustrates a judgment that takes place at the return of Christ immediately after the tribulation of those days, verse 29, can it be said that the world will understand nothing of the devastating judgments that have been afflicting them? At the sixth seal judgment of Revelation, people know fully that the wrath of God has come. They cry out to the rocks, "Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" Revelation 6:6-17. The calamities that precede the second coming of Christ will be so severe that the human race will be close to extinction apart from the Lord's intervention. Matthew 24:22. Would Jesus use a description of casual lifestyles in Matthew 24:37-39 to communicate what the world would be like when there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will? Matthew 24:21. This seems most unlikely. The flood of Noah's day corresponds to the time leading up to the sudden arrival of the day of the Lord and the pre-tribulation rapture. So I think that's a great synopsis of really what I'm trying to communicate here. It just doesn't fit. There's many other great scholars who have also acknowledged this obvious context problem for those who deny what I'm presenting. But I'm going to just quickly share with you one more. And this is from Zane Hodges. And he says this: the flood came at a time when nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. But this would not be true of Jesus' coming if his coming occurs at the conclusion of the Great Tribulation, the second coming proper. This obvious problem is often ignored. All right, so if you disagree with me, that's fine, but you have to wrestle with this. You have to make it fit, and it just doesn't fit. Now, before we go on, I really want you guys to comprehend what you're forced to deal with if you deny what I'm trying to present in this video. And to do that, I'm going to read you one more quote. This is from an online Bible commentary, and it does a great job of expressing the contextual problems that a person just has to deal with if they deny the context shift in verse 36. Please listen to what it says. The logic here is undeniable. Matthew 24:36-51 is a difficult passage to interpret, and there is no clear consensus on how it should be interpreted, even among conservative evangelical writers. Why is this section so difficult? As if Matthew 24:1-35 is not difficult enough? Dilemma is defined as a situation in which a difficult choice has to be made between two or more alternatives. Here, the dilemma is, how can Jesus' second coming be preceded by clear signs in Matthew 24:15, Matthew 24:21, Matthew 24:27, Matthew 24:29, and others, and still be a time regarding which Jesus says, "Of that day and hour no one knows"? In addition, Jesus' warnings against being unprepared in Matthew 24:36-51 seem to be describing a time, as in the days of Noah, in which it's business as usual for the world. Matthew 24:37 and 38 and following. And yet we know that in the time of the Great Tribulation, there will be business like the world has never seen, nor will ever see again. Matthew 24:21. At that time, believers and even unbelievers, Revelation 6:16-17, will surely be aware of the fact that the end of the age and the return of the King is near. Luke 21:28. And because of the distinct time segments, 7 years, 3.5 years, 1260 days, and 42 months of the 70th week of Daniel, it would seem to be theoretically possible to know the day of Jesus' return. And yet Jesus clearly states, not even the Son knows. So how can men expect to know? Can you see the dilemma that these passages in Matthew 24 pose? I must confess that I'm at a loss to explain how, on one hand, signs point to his return, and on the other hand, we cannot know the day nor the hour. All right, so when you really consider everything, the problems are monumental, but they're all very easily solved just by recognizing the simple fact that verse 36 is transitional, and it reverts back to the beginning of the parousia, which is when we know the pre-tribulational rapture takes place. Simple. There's really no reason to oppose this, and there's every reason to accept it. It solves infinitely more problems than it creates. And they really, the only ones it supposedly creates are more apparent problems than real problems when you really look deeper into them. It really doesn't create any actual problems. But let's move on now to reason number 5, which involved ones taken and those left. And this phrase comes from the parable that Jesus told, as we mentioned, after he discussed the example of the days of Noah. But just to make sure it's fresh in our minds, let's go back and read it again. Verse 36, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. 2 women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. All right, so this verse can be understood a couple of different ways. We see the mention of the 2 in the field, one taken, one left, the 2 at the mill, one taken and one left. There's a couple of ways to interpret this. Those, of course, who see this as referring to the coming of Christ at the end of the tribulation, then, of course, think that the ones taken are the wicked ones, taken in judgment, since there's a judgment at the end of the tribulation. And those, of course, then who are left behind have to be the righteous ones who are left to enter into the blessings of the millennial kingdom. But those people like myself who believe that verse 36 changes the context back to the beginning of the Parousia period and then continues all throughout until 25:13, understand that the one taken is the righteous one, raptured, lifted up out of harm's way at the beginning of this time period, while the one who's left is then the wicked one who's left behind to enter the judgment of the broad day. Just like in the previous example of Noah, it was the righteous one who was removed to a place of safety, that being inside the ark, which was then lifted up over the destruction that was taking place beneath it, while the wicked ones were left behind down below in the waters of the flood, being swept away down there in the judgment. Now, since the one taken and the one left, these analogies directly follow the Noah example, it has to be understood as a further explanation or a further elaboration of the same point. So whatever is true of the Noah example has to follow in the ones who are taken and left. But like I said at the beginning, the view that I'm presenting in this video seems to be the minority view, at least among pre-trib Bible teachers. They embrace the first interpretation that I just explained, that this is an end of the tribulation context and has nothing to do with the rapture, that the wicked are taken in judgment and the righteous are left behind to enter the millennium. And again, they believe that the word taken, as in one will be taken, connects with how verse 39 had said, the flood came and took them all away, meaning that obviously it would be the wicked ones who are taken to judgment, not the righteous ones taken in rapture. So in other words, the English translates both of these Greek words as the same English word took or taken. And so in English, it's easy to make that false connection. But the reality is that these are two totally, completely different words in the Greek. The word for took in verse 39, the flood took them all away, is the Greek word airo, while the Greek word for taken in verses 40 and 41, the ones taken from the field and the mill, is paralambano. Two completely different words. Now, let me quickly say before we look deeper into these two words and how they support the view that I'm presenting, is that post-tribulationists, of course, have no problem finding a rapture, obviously a post-tribulational rapture, in these verses 40 and 41. And they think it's the same gathering spoken of earlier in relation to the second coming proper of Christ at the end of the tribulation in verses 29 to 31, where it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Right, where it speaks of this worldwide regathering, which I said refers to the final worldwide regathering of Israel that's spoken of using the same exact language all throughout the Old Testament. And those verses have nothing at all to do with the rapture. Now, follow me on this. The pre-tribbers who disagree with what I'm presenting here agree with the post-tribbers in that both of them overlook the transitional nature of verse 36. But the pre-tribbers would deny any rapture at all in any of these verses. So what I'm saying is the gathering in 29 to 31 is definitely not a rapture. So we agree on that. But these pre-tribbers are overlooking all the evidence that I've presented to you in this video so far that shows how verse 36 and everything that follows it is transitional. They overlook the peri-day. They overlook the context problems. They overlook the contrasting halves of the discourse. They overlook the fact that the latter half explicitly answers the disciples' when question, etc. So I hope you guys are following this. I'm trying very hard to make this clear. But let's look further into airo and paralambano. You're going to see that these two Greek words actually support the shift that I'm presenting to you, the shift in context. And paralambano fits much better with a pre-trib rapture interpretation for those who are taken, as Jesus mentions here, rather than the interpretation that they get taken in judgment, as many pre-trib believers want to convince you. Now, in fact, I'm actually going to begin with an excellent quote by a post-tribulationalist, Robert Gundry, and he does an incredible job in this quote of demonstrating why the pre-tribbers who disagree with me are wrong on this issue. So in other words, because of the transitional nature in verse 36, some of the exegetical evidence put forward by post-tribbers for seeing a rapture in verses 40 to 41 can now actually be turned in support of a pre-trib rapture in these same verses because we understand that there's a context shift in verse 36. All right? So Gundry says this: two different words appear for the action of taking, airo in verse 39 and paralambano in verses 40 to 41. The same word could easily have been employed had an exact parallel between the two takings been intended. Instead, we have the employment of another word, which only 2 days later describes the rapture in John 14:3. The apostles would naturally have associated the two expressions. Jesus probably so intended, else he would have drawn a distinction. In light of this, the change from airo to paralambano indicates a change in topic and connotation. The former term refers to judgment, similar in unexpectedness to the flood. The latter to reception of the saints at the rapture, to be forever with their Lord. Confer with 1 Thessalonians 4:17 and John 14:3. So Gundry, although I completely disagree with him on his conclusion of a post-trib rapture, obviously, despite that, he makes some heavy-hitting points here that we can't overlook. But the one that I want to focus on mainly is the fact that very soon after the Olivet Discourse, Jesus would then give another discourse where he would reveal in even greater detail the rapture. And this is called the Upper Room Discourse. as it's often called. This is in John chapter 14. And in that discourse, Jesus again uses the word paralambano to describe how we're taken to him at the rapture. And no pre-trib believer would deny this. So they agree with it in John 14, but not in Matthew 24. So let me show you this, and then we'll talk more about it. So John 14:3 says, "And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also." All right, so here Jesus is disclosing the rapture of the church in even greater detail. And he uses paralambano when he says, "I will come again and receive you unto myself." That word receive is paralambano. So Jesus uses paralambano to explicitly refer to the rapture, only 2 days after he uses the same term, paralambano, to specifically refer to ones taken from the field and from the mill, specifically instead of using iro, which he had used in the previous verse to describe ones who were left behind to be swept away by the flood judgment. Why did he deliberately switch Greek words in back-to-back passages? Clearly, because he's intending it to be understood as a change in topic or connotation. Just like Gundry said, he was correct about that. Absolutely. Now, what does paralambano actually mean? And how is it often used in the Bible? Does it always mean something positive or always something negative? Because maybe that can help us definitively answer this. Well, it can be used in either sense. And so we have to understand it according to the context in each usage. But generally, in fact, actually overwhelmingly, it's used in a positive sense. It's generally agreed that paralambano means to take to or to take with oneself. And the thought is accompaniment. It's you're taking someone to yourself with you. And it's almost always used in a very positive sense to express taking someone with you for close fellowship. But since it really can be used in either way, depending on the context, then of course the context in each usage has to be the deciding factor. And yet again, the overwhelmingly positive uses do support the view that I'm presenting. But also the specific use in this context, as I've already given you strong evidence for. We've talked all about the context. It just doesn't fit with an end of the tribulation setting. But I want to share with you further evidence that, in my mind at least, absolutely is a clincher for this. So we talked about paralambano, the Greek word for taken, but let's also look at the Greek word translated as left in these verses, where it says those that are left in the field and at the mill. This is the Greek word aphemi. And it's very convincing, I think, to note that everywhere else in Matthew's gospel, where this word aphemi is used to refer to a person, it takes on the meaning of abandonment or being forsaken or to be left out. There's about 8 examples of this. Matthew 4:11 and 22, Matthew 8:15, Matthew 13:36, Matthew 19:29, Matthew 22:22, and verse 25. Also Matthew 26:56. And there's others. And so already this doesn't seem to fit with the interpretation that those being left are being left out or abandoned to enter the blessings of the millennial kingdom. It just really doesn't fit with the way that aphemi is used, especially in Matthew. And this word is used nowhere in the entire New Testament to describe what God will do to believers. It's just not used that way. But in fact, it's specifically used to describe what he will not do to believers. Guys, please get this. This is in John 14:18, where he says he's not going to abandon us, aphemi, as orphans. It says this, "I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you." Now that's the NASB, but the KJV says, "I will not leave you comfortless." But the Greek word for comfortless is orphanos, and it's where we get our word orphan. So it's essentially saying that he won't leave us as orphans. And the word leave is aphemi. So he's literally saying, I won't abandon you. I won't aphemi you. Right? An orphan is an abandoned child, in essence. And so I think this really ends the debate. Ephemi is not something positive, and it's something the Lord said he specifically will not do to believers. So it would be, I think, extremely strange to be tempted to believe that he would use this word to describe the righteous people who are being left to enter the kingdom. But I think it would fit much better, perfectly even, to describe those who are being left behind, or abandoned, or forsaken to have to enter into eschatological judgment. That's a much more natural understanding according to how this word is seen elsewhere being used. And so paralambano is describing those being taken in the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, the righteous ones who are being removed in order to abandon, or ephemi, the wicked to the judgment. Now, before we go on, there's another argument by pre-tribbers who think this refers to the end of the tribulation that I just want to address very quickly. They see a parallel recording of this one taken and one left excerpt in Luke chapter 17. And in Luke 17, this mention of one taken and one left is followed in the text by the disciples asking, "Where, Lord?" And so it seems, maybe when you read it, that they're asking, "Where are they taken, Lord?" And the Lord then answers by saying, "Wherever the corpses are, or the dead bodies, that's where the eagles or the vultures are going to be gathered," which obviously refers to judgment at the end of the tribulation. So they think that this confirms their interpretation. Now, like I said, I can't spend too much time on this here. I have a whole video on it called "The Vultures and the Carcasses" that you guys can look into for a more full breakdown. But to summarize, no, the disciples were not asking, "Where, Lord?" in response to the ones taken and ones left statement. They were asking it in response to Jesus's earlier statement about his physical appearing, which is what the parallel excerpt in Matthew 24 clearly has it referring to. So by applying the "where, Lord" in Luke 17 to the ones taken and ones left, these people are actually creating a much worse problem of applying it in that chapter differently than it's clearly being applied in Matthew 24. So anyway, look back to that earlier video for more information on that. There's a very easy, very clear explanation for that. Makes complete sense. All right, so let's now move on to reason number 6, the thief in the night imagery. This is one that I've discussed a lot in my book, The Missing Key. So I hope a lot of you, or at least some of you who have read it, are going to be familiar with it, but I've talked about it a lot on my channel too. So if you've watched me for a while, this should be review material. But this is the next thing that Jesus mentions after discussing Noah and then the ones who are taken and ones left. So we're really just going verse to verse, just showing how literally this entire thing does not fit with an end of the tribulation context and can only fit with the beginning of the broad day of the Lord, beginning of the Parousia, pre-tribulational rapture context. So let's go ahead now and read this. Again, I'm going to just reread it all the way from verse 36, just so you guys can see how each time we add another verse or two onto this, it's all part of the same discourse. It's all saying the same thing in the same context. It's all an expansion of the same context of imminence, suddenness, unpredictability, coming without warning, and how none of this fits at all with an end of the tribulation context. It's just not compatible. So let's go back to verse 36 and start from there again. It says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in which watch the thief would come, he would have watched, and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh." So he keeps repeating that same thing, the unknowableness of the timing of his coming. So this is all an expansion of the same exact point and the same exact context. So let's go through this in a little bit more depth. So, guys, again, verse 36, Jesus begins by describing the total suddenness, the total unpredictability of this aspect of his parousia. And again, it can only refer to the beginning aspect, not the ending or the climactic aspect. He then gives the Noah example to further elaborate on that same point, where he again points to the suddenness of the coming of the judgment, the coming of the parousia during a time of otherwise normalcy, where people are just going about routine normalcy. But that at this time, when it happens, the righteous are removed to safety, while the judgment immediately starts to fall on those who are left, the wicked. Now, only the beginning of the broad day can initiate suddenly and take people off guard and be unpredictable and unknowable. We've said this over and over, but I want to make sure you guys get this context going into this passage about the thief. Only the beginning of the broad day can catch anyone off guard. It's the only time where unpredictability and unknowability can coexist, where the righteous are imminently removed and also imminent judgment falls simultaneously on the ones who are left. All right? That's the only context that works. And then he further validates that same point. He expands that same point with the illustrations of the ones taken and ones left, who were also apparently really hit suddenly with this while they were doing tasks of normalcy. So it's a context again of imminence with a simultaneous separation of the righteous and the wicked. And again, that's a huge theme in my book, The Missing Key. All right, something that I would think most everybody in the prophecy world has overlooked, but it's all throughout the New Testament. And after this, then Jesus moves to further illustrate this context of imminency by using the parable of a thief in the night who comes suddenly. It's all the same, without signs, without warning. It's the constant threat of the thief's unpredictable coming that forces the homeowner to have to perpetually watch. And again, he's not watching perpetually for some sign, but he's watching for the person of the thief himself. That's the whole point. There are no signs, there's no forewarnings that relate in any way to the coming of a thief. Guys, that's the whole point of a thief. A thief's entire purpose and mission is to not give any sign of predictability to the homeowner. That's how they move. That's how they enter into your house secretly, suddenly, without you knowing, and take your goods. That's what they do. That's what a thief does. And that's how Jesus describes his parousia. He says that's how he's coming, not only for the wicked, but for all. That's why he even says the angels of heaven don't know either. And he even includes himself, the Son. He doesn't know. And so clearly it's not an issue of only the unrighteous not knowing. No, he's telling his own followers of the need for perpetual watchfulness because it's going to be sudden and unpredictable to everyone. Guys, you can't miss this. The entire thing, he keeps saying it. Watch. You don't know when it's going to happen. No one knows. It's the whole point. He's talking to his disciples, the righteous. And again, what does he mean by watch? We'll talk about that more in reason number 7. But the entire premise of eschatological watchfulness itself is another proof of this context as relating to the imminent rapture and the simultaneous beginning of the broad day. By watchfulness, what does he mean? Again, he means spiritual readiness, because those spiritually ready when he comes back are going to be taken, just like he had said in the previous verses, just like he said when using the illustration of Noah, where the righteous were taken immediately as judgment fell. And the same thing with the people in the field and at the mill. It's the same. And he's saying the same thing here with the thief. The conclusion is simple. It's right there in verse 44. Since you don't know when he's coming, and it's going to be totally sudden, you need to be spiritually ready. It's that simple. If you're spiritually ready, you're going to get paralambanoed, or taken to be with him, taken to himself for fellowship. If you're not ready, you're going to get ephemied, or abandoned to enter eschatological judgment. Now, the point here that I really want you guys to come away with is that the usage of the thief imagery itself absolutely depends on a context of imminence. It's the entire point. There is no other context where even the mention of the thief in this way can be mentioned, can be used, can be intended. There is nothing else. The end of the tribulation cannot refer to the coming of a thief. Nothing about it is compatible. And also, there needs to be a consistency of interpretation wherever we find these thief mentions throughout the New Testament, because it's used a handful of times. It always tells you that the context relates to imminence. It guides your understanding of what the person is talking about, writing about. And the only context of eschatology that's imminent, that's compatible with this, is the absolute beginning. When it kicks off, when it initiates, the beginning of the broad day of the Lord, when the parousia happens, when the pre-trib rapture jumps it all off. That's why in some passages it refers to the coming of the day of the Lord as coming like a thief. You remember we read the writing of Paul in Thessalonians, how the day of the Lord comes like a thief in the night. But in other passages, it refers to Jesus's parousia, Jesus himself, his coming, happening like a thief in the night. What's the point? They're the same. They're simultaneous. Jesus comes at the absolute beginning of the broad day of the Lord. It's all talking about the same thing, which again is the topic of the book. So the thief in the night parable is completely, wholly incompatible with any time after this day commences. And it certainly cannot be in any way harmonized with the end of the tribulation. Now, another piece of evidence that the thief analogy does not refer to the end of the tribulation comes from the fact that it's not mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament. I want you to think about this. I don't think I've ever said this on my channel or in any of my articles or in the books. This is the first time I'm saying this. This is a piece of evidence, guys. The Old Testament never talks about the coming of the Lord by using a thief analogy. I'm not aware of it anywhere. If I'm wrong, please put it in the comments. I don't think I'm wrong. Now, despite that, the second coming at the end of the tribulation, what I call the second coming proper, is mentioned many times in the Old Testament. That aspect of his coming is known. It is greatly talked about throughout the Old Testament prophets. So are you understanding the contrast here? The thief, the mention of the thief in the night, this is new revelation. It's something that's revealed in the New Testament, which again contributes to the case that it refers to something else other than the coming at the end of the tribulation. It's a totally different aspect of his coming. Again, it always refers to the beginning. Now, a final point that absolutely clinches this reason number 6, and so many people overlook this, is that the other New Testament writers, the writers of the epistles who came after Jesus wrote this in Matthew 24, they interpreted Jesus's mention of the thief in the night imagery for us in their writings. And in their writings, they apply it to the beginning of the broad day when the rapture happens. I showed you this earlier in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 to 18, where Paul begins to discuss the rapture, and then he moves seamlessly into what we now call chapter 5, and he discusses the imminence of its timing, or the times and the seasons, and he connects it with the beginning of the broad day of the Lord in those same verses, and he uses the thief imagery to express it, exactly like Jesus did here. He got it from Jesus. He's not using it differently. As I said before, I think I gave you about 5 or more parallels, contextual parallels between Matthew 24 and what Paul wrote here in 1 Thessalonians. What Paul wrote here in 1 Thessalonians, showing that it's absolutely identical. Now, furthermore, I don't have too much time to spend on this, but in addition to the thief imagery, there's a second illustration that Jesus often uses in the same exact context and to express really the same exact thing as the thief. And it's the idea of a master returning home to his house, to his estate, where his servants are waiting for him. Jesus uses this side by side with the thief example, and he equivalently, he makes them equivalent. He equivocates them. They're used exactly the same. They're used side by side. Again, one is used as an expansion of the other. And then that same idiom is repeated the master coming home to his house. He's on the threshold of entrance. It's an any moment entrance. It's again meant to convey imminence, just like the imminent coming of a thief. The homeowner has to watch, and then the imminent coming of the homeowner, the servants have to watch. So he's using it exactly the same. And then the New Testament writers apply that idiom to the rapture of the church at the beginning of the broad day. James does this. John does this. Now, I don't have time in this video to go through all those passages, but it's in other videos I talk about, and it's in the book. So really what I want to convey here is that the Bible interprets itself. It gives us the necessary interpretation that we have to embrace. We can't interpret Jesus differently than the epistolary writers did, right? So the later New Testament writers understood these equivalent idioms of the thief in the night and the returning master of the house to represent the parousia of Christ when he comes for the church at the beginning of this period. They interpret it for us, guys. And so obviously we have to understand Jesus in the same way that they did. All right, moving on to our final reason number 7, Jesus's exhortations to watch. Now, this is the final reason that we're going to discuss today. I know it's been a super long video. My voice is already getting kind of weak, so congratulations if you've made it this far. Now, this is one that we've already briefly mentioned at certain points throughout the video, but it really deserves its own section because it's a profound proof, I think, of the pre-trib rapture being in Matthew 24 all by itself. Now, we were already mentioned how the entire point of these commands toward watchfulness by Jesus, watchfulness for the coming of the Lord, for his coming, are entirely built upon the premise of imminence. The entire point is that there are no signs, which means that you have to continually watch for the Lord himself. Since you're not going to have forewarnings, you're not going to have prerequisites, you're not going to have preconditions or indicators of when he's coming. It's a signless event. It's sudden. It's unpredictable. As he repeatedly stated throughout the Noah example, throughout the thief example, throughout the equivalent master returning to his house example. And of course, as he blatantly stated ad nauseum, explicitly, nobody will know. It's going to happen when you don't expect, etc. It's the entire ongoing continual point of this latter half of the discourse. It's all based on the premise of imminence. That's the continued theme, the larger theme. And so the exhortation toward continual eschatological watchfulness in light of that imminence goes right along with that. And that's why we see it continually being mentioned throughout this half of the discourse, and also in parallel passages where the context is also very clearly imminence. Let's talk a little bit more about it. To watch. This is the Greek word gregoreo, meaning to watch or to be alert, to be awake. And it's actually used 22 times in the New Testament, with over half of those usages, 12 to be exact, being used in prophetic contexts. Now, 10 of them are used by Jesus himself, and then twice by Paul. And what you're going to notice if you do a word study on this Greek word gregoreo or gregoreo, all throughout the New Testament, you're going to find that when it's used in these prophetic eschatological contexts, meaning to watch for the Lord's coming, actually 8 of the 12 show up in direct connection to the use of the thief imagery, which again is all about imminence. And so again, we see that the call to watchfulness is a very common accompaniment to eschatological imminence contexts. Actually, even apart from prophecy. Now, one example I can show you apart from prophecy is in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus told his disciples to stay alert, gregoreo, because temptation was imminent. In Matthew 26:45, Jesus says, "Behold, the hour is at hand," which is a statement of imminence. At hand means it can happen at any moment. It can begin at any time. And again, this usage had absolutely nothing to do with eschatology, and yet we still see the call to gregoreo, or watchfulness, being used in imminence-related situations. And I'll show you another example. It's Acts 20:29-31. And Paul said here that the church needed to be alert, gregoreo, because when he leaves, false teachers would begin to infiltrate the church. All right. He says the infiltration would be imminent after his departure. Another example is 1 Peter 5:18, where Peter instructs his audience to watch Gregoreo, since Satan may attack at any moment. It's an imminent attack. So these are three examples where Gregoreo is also connected with imminence, despite the fact that none of them have anything to do with eschatology. And so I show you all of these examples just to drive home how these concepts of watchfulness and imminence are connected contextually. They go together. And so then when we look at this latter half of Matthew 24, we find that Jesus's entire point is imminence, as I said. And he sprinkled these calls to watchfulness all throughout. We read it earlier. After the context shifts to imminence in verse 36, we start to see these calls to watchfulness. He explicitly teaches the imminence of his return. We see it over and over, and he then uses the Noah example, the thief examples, etc., all to express this same unified message of imminence. And his conclusion is in verse 42. So everything he's spoken about regarding imminence, what's the lesson? The lesson is Gregoreo, watch. Verse 42, watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. All right, guys, please get this. You're instructed to watch because the time is unknowable, because it's imminent, because you won't know until it happens. Just exactly like the flood. They were living normal life. They knew nothing until it happened. All right. Now that was the wicked, but it's the same thing here. The point is that nobody's going to know the timing, the righteous or the wicked, which again is why he refers to the angels. He refers to himself, and he's speaking to his believers this whole time. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. Your Lord, guys, are you hearing this? Your Lord. He's speaking to the righteous. He's not speaking to the unrighteous. He wouldn't refer to himself as their Lord. Guys, please get this. There's no precursors. There's no signs of his coming to alert you ahead of time. So you have to perpetually watch for him himself, because the event itself, his coming itself, is imminent. So that's verse 42. But then also verse 44, he sort of states the same thing, except a little bit differently. Now, a common teaching or a literary device in Greek and Hebrew is to do this, where you express one thought in two or more ways in order basically for your audience to fully understand your meaning. So basically, if you didn't understand what he said the first time, I'll rephrase it for you slightly so that you get it the next time. That's what he's doing here. Verse 44, he says, therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. So you can think of it as an equivalent or as an equation. Watch, for ye know not. Therefore, be ready, for ye know not. So he's connecting watchfulness with readiness. He's saying the same thing twice. He's using watchfulness and readiness the same way. So that means that what he's really telling you is what he means by watch is be ready. How do you be ready? Well, it's speaking about a spiritual condition. He's speaking about spiritual readiness, spiritual preparation for his parousia, because he just got done saying that at that time, the righteous are going to be removed to safety like Noah, and then the wicked are going to be forsaken or left, abandoned to enter the judgment. So the real point behind watchfulness is readiness. It's an idiom for spiritual readiness. Are you saved? He doesn't mean literally go stare at the sky until you see Jesus. That's not going to help you guys. It's not going to help you. The point is that the constant awareness of his any moment coming should motivate you, should propel you into a state of being continually spiritually ready at all times. It's the same thing that we might say today. If I say, let's go out to dinner, I'll come pick you up sometime in the next hour. I don't give you an exact time. I just say, watch for me. What I mean is not to just go stare at your window until my car appears. That doesn't help us. What I really mean is go take a shower, get dressed, and be ready to leave with me when I arrive. And since you don't know the exact time, just go do it right away, get ready right away, and be perpetually then ready and waiting. It's that simple. We do this all the time. It has absolutely nothing to do with physically watching for some supposed signs, of which Jesus' entire point is there are none. You have to watch for him because there are none. So Jesus mentions this repeatedly, but also into chapter 25. This same imminence theme continues. Verse 13. Take a look at it. He concludes the purpose of his mention of the several parables that he gave by saying again, he summarizes it by saying, this is the takeaway. This is the message of the parables. Watch therefore, right? Don't miss it. It's the word therefore. So I told you about all these parables. I'm telling you about them because you need to watch. Therefore, watch therefore. For you know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. Okay, here's where I'm going to absolutely prove what I'm saying to you, beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. We've discussed how these calls to watchfulness always relate to imminence. And in the context of eschatology, they always refer to the only time period within eschatology that's imminent to us. The beginning of the broad day, when the parousia begins, with the opening event of the pre-trib rapture of the church. So I'm about to prove that to you right now. So come with me to the most famous, most well-known, indisputable rapture passage in the entire Bible, the one that we looked at before, at the end of 1 Thessalonians 4. Starting at verse 13, I'm going to read this to you. It says, "But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep. For ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore comfort one another with these words." Okay, so the context is the rapture at the beginning of the broad day. We talked about this. We know this. Now, Paul continues the same discussion into chapter 5. We've spoken about it constantly in this video, but this time we're going to keep reading past the part that we discussed already. I'm going to show you something further. So let's continue. Let's pick right up with verse 1. "But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. Ye are all the children of light, and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch, gregoreo, and be sober. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night. But let us, who are of the day, be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for an helmet the hope of salvation. For God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ." Okay, guys, did you catch it? Paul is instructing us, the church, to watch, gregoreo, for the rapture, the opening event that kicks off the timeline of eschatology, the broad day of the Lord, as he just mentioned here. So I want you to apply this logic. If Paul himself is very clearly applying this call to eschatological watchfulness, gregoreo, to the rapture, and as we said, this passage is a perfect mirror of Matthew 24. And Paul actually got this teaching from Jesus in places like Matthew 24 and parallel teachings. Then obviously, Paul is using it in the same exact way that Jesus did, in the same context that Jesus did. He's applying it to the beginning of the broad day, which he mentioned explicitly in verse 2. connecting its sudden imminent coming with the thief, coming at a time of routine normalcy. People are expecting peace and safety, which is when the pre-tribulational rapture that he just talked about at the end of chapter 4 takes place. Remember, he's talking about the times and the seasons now of that event that he just described, the rapture. And he says, you don't know when it's going to be. And then he starts talking about the sudden, imminent beginning of the broad day of the Lord when it takes place. And then he tells you to watch for it. Gregoreo. Guys, no pre-tribulationalist on the planet would say that Paul is referring here to the end of the tribulation. None. But yet they try to convince you that Jesus' context in Matthew 24, when he says all these same things, including these calls to Gregoreo, eschatological watchfulness. No, guys, Paul got this teaching from Jesus. They're saying the same thing. They're speaking about the same moment in time. And they could only be speaking about one moment in time, because there is only one moment in time within eschatology that can be described this way, with all these imminence idioms. And that's the absolute beginning of this time period called the broad day of the Lord, which is when the rapture happens, beginning the parousia of Christ. Guys, imminence is always speaking about the beginning of the parousia. I think I've said that probably 1,000 times in this video, but people overlook that. It's the key to understanding any of these passages. Once you see imminence language, you know exactly the context. It's the only time it can take anyone off guard suddenly by surprise. Never can refer to the ending of the parousia, which is a climax of a long sequence of observable, predictable signs, which once certain things take place, then you can literally calculate how many days, how many months, how many years it's going to be until the end of the tribulation. I hope this is easy to see. And so as we wrap up this long teaching, let me just summarize by saying that seeing the pre-tribulation rapture at the beginning of the broad day of the Lord is the best exegetical and theological interpretation of the latter half of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. Again, beginning at verse 36 and continuing, as all 7 of these reasons that I showed you actually require. They require it. And I'll say that this contextual shift is also in Mark's recording of the Olivet Discourse and in Luke's recording. I speak about that more in depth in the video that I mentioned earlier, the Olivet Discourse, Deciphering the Dilemma, which again, I strongly encourage you guys to go and watch if you haven't seen it. It's going to connect all of these dots. It's going to drive all this home in, I think, a very powerful way. And it's going to discuss things that we didn't really have time to go into so much in this video. And of course, all of this comes right out of my book, The Missing Key, which has detailed explanations, tons of quotes, tons of citations, goes into a lot more than just this. So if you want to get yourself a copy, it is on Amazon, but I would recommend that you get it from the Prophecy Watchers bookstore. So really, it was Jesus here in Matthew 24 who was planting the seeds of a doctrine that the Apostle Paul would later expound upon more fully, which we today recognize as the pre-tribulational rapture of the church. And of course, we talked about it at the beginning of this video. We couldn't expect Jesus's audience at that time, on the day that the discourse was given, to fully comprehend church age truth at that point. And it wasn't his intention for them to. The point is that Jesus would gradually, progressively reveal new truths that his disciples would only later be able to fully comprehend. And he did this really in all areas of his teaching. They never grasped it immediately. Think about it. This is what a good teacher does. He would reveal it layer by layer, bit by bit, piece by piece. Just like right in chapter 16, he would begin to introduce the church, calling it by name in verse 18. Now, of course, we don't expect that he was expecting them at that time to fully understand everything that the church was. Of course not. But it was the gradual revealing of a new paradigm to his audience. Again, like any master teacher would do. This is what a good teacher does. You don't just dump a new thing on somebody. You reveal it, you unveil it piece by piece, layer by layer. At the time of the Olivet Discourse, they, of course, wouldn't recognize it as the rapture with all the fullness of understanding that we see today, because we've been beneficiaries of the rest of the New Testament. But Jesus was beginning the process of revealing this doctrine. He was beginning to reveal the building blocks that these later doctrines concerning the church would be built on and would later be expounded on in more detail. And so there's no problem seeing Jesus planting the seeds of the pre-trib rapture in the Olivet Discourse. Again, he had already mentioned the church by name 8 chapters before. And only 2 days later, he would then reveal the rapture in even more detail in John 14, the upper room discourse. And nobody disputes that. Nobody has a problem with that. And so there's really no legitimate argument against seeing him here in Matthew 24 planting these seed doctrines. At that time, he really just expected them to recognize that at the beginning of the broad day, the righteous would be rescued. That's it. He didn't expect them to understand it as the church. He didn't expect them to understand the inter-Advent age fully or what the church age would be in its fullness. No. He was just expecting them to understand that the righteous people at that time are removed to avoid the judgment. Simple. And later revelation would build on that. John 14, the writings of the Apostle Paul. And so we now today, having all of these revelations, we can look back on this teaching of Jesus in Matthew 24 and be able to perfectly understand what he was communicating as he planted those seed doctrines of the pre-tribulational rapture. And as we said before, that's clearly how the later New Testament writers also interpreted it. So I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope this was a blessing to you. Please share this teaching, and if you enjoyed it, please give it a like. Please also feel free to leave a comment or a question. God bless you. Thank you for watching.